D-Day, the longest day. Today, Allied leaders and thousands of veterans gathered on the Normandy beaches, where invasion forces dealt a decisive blow to the Nazi occupation of Europe 50 years ago. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Live at 5. I'm Nancy Regan.
And I'm Bill Jessen. Paul Meunier is on vacation. D-Day commemorations have ended in Canada and, of course, in Normandy. But the memories linger on. Tonight on Live at 5, a look back to our future. A pledge not to forget the sacrifice Canadians made, and at what price.
The events on the Normandy beaches 50 years ago today will be burned in the minds of the troops who were there as long as they live. ATV's Jonathan Kay spent this June 6th talking with some Maritimers who landed on the beaches in 1944. Jonathan asked them what they remember most about the invasion, and usually, apparently, it's the moment the door on the landing craft swung open, when they saw the enemy for the very first time at very close range, and when they saw the sheer size of the operation in which they were to take part.
Everything was such confusing, in those times.
This is the view Tom Colbert and his fellow soldiers faced 50 years ago. He'll always remember the moment he stepped off the landing craft into the water.
Only on the craft going in, I think that was one of the hardest things, because waiting was worse than moving. See? And the people were firing at you, but you couldn't fire back because you weren't ready.
The troops got off the craft into water that was between chest and waist high. It was cold, too, but they didn't notice. They were too busy to notice.
The North Novus was the leading battalion of the Reserve Brigade, 9th Highland Brigade. The 8th Brigade, the Queen's Own, had landed in front of us on the North Shore on our left. And the idea was that we were to land, pass through the 8th Brigade, and take the lead later in the day.
A radio operator with the North Shore Regiment, Oral Vino's most vivid memory of D-Day results from him being a prime target for German guns.
The Germans didn't like fellows with a microphone and a aerial sticking out of his back, and I always had the idea that the poor fellow coming behind me got a bullet that was meant for me.
Not just soldiers, but sailors, too, came ashore that day. Milton Kroll was in charge of one of the landing crafts that ferried soldiers from the ships to the beaches throughout the invasion.
A later trip, I would come ashore with my barge and go for a walk up the beach. And I saw in one particular section of the beach dead bodies piled as high as a 2-story house. And I went up and I looked at some of those bodies, and they were some of the very ones that I took ashore. Yeah. And that will remain with me.
That's the thing we learn most about talking with veterans, is that no matter how much they tell us, no matter how many times we look at those pictures, it's really simply not possible for us to even imagine what things were like on those beaches, Nancy.
Jonathan, I'm curious, how are the veterans you spoke with today spending D-Day in 1994?
Well, that's almost as personal a subject as their memories, Nancy. Mr. Kroll, for example, spent today talking about his D-Day experiences for a luncheon with the Dartmouth Rotary Club. Other people are spending it at Legion, surrounded just by other veterans, and still others are taking sort of a quiet day of solitude in quiet remembrance of the people who didn't come home with them.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Many moving stories, and now we want to take a look at how those moving stories were reported 50 years ago. Here's Bill.
Thank you, Nancy. The Second World War had been raging for 5 years before the D-Day invasion. So when word broke here at home, it was greeted with anticipation, a feeling that this would be the beginning of the end for Germany. Newspapers from across the Maritimes screamed with headlines lauding the downfall of Nazi Germany. The St. John Telegraph Journal has the Allies dashing into France from many beachheads. The St. John Evening Times Globe blares, "Invasion confirmed. Allies land in France," while the Sydney Post record posts, "Allies invade. Invaders seize beachheads in France." In Halifax, the Herald beamed, "Invasion strikes Nazis, says Allies land in France." While across town, the Mail proclaimed Beachhead 1 pushing inland. But before newspapers went to print, many Canadians first learned of the invasion with this historic broadcast.
This is the National News Bulletin, a summary of the day's news. The dagger pointed at the heart of Berlin has been driven into the side of Nazi Europe. The first news of the mightiest military operation of all history came at 38 minutes past 8 Eastern Daylight Time last, when the Germans broadcast a report that Le Havre was being bombarded. The official account is rounded out by dispatches from correspondents. They say that Canadian, American, and British troops landed on the Normandy coast in northern France. One report indicates that the Canadians may be among the troops fighting tonight at Caen, but the report isn't confirmed.
Many Canadians who landed on Juno Beach 50 years ago today are gathered once again in Normandy today to remember. Joining us now live from Normandy is correspondent Judy Fortin. Judy, it's been quite a day for Canadians there.
Nancy, it's been quite a day for all of the Allied veterans, about 35,000 in all. The sun is beginning to set here on the Normandy coast, and there are so many memories that the Allied veterans will be leaving this area with, and they have really become a part of history themselves. It's been said that this 50th anniversary commemoration is the biggest ever, and certainly the Canadians were a very important part of that. And your Prime Minister, as well as your Governor General, were among 17 other heads of state and government who descended on this region today. Actually, not too far from where I am right now on Omaha Beach. President Clinton was there from the United States, as well as Queen Elizabeth. It was a day of tributes and honor to those who 50 years ago risked their lives in this very area. Nancy?
Judy, Prime Minister Chrétien made a very emotional speech today. Can you tell me, what is the most prevalent feeling there? Is it sorrow for those lost 50 years ago, or pride in such a momentous achievement?
Nancy, it's both. Certainly for the veterans coming back, there is excitement over being treated as heroes, returning to the land that they were on so long ago. But also there is a solemn remembrance for all those people who died, and more than 9,300 are buried right behind me in this American cemetery. Certainly there are other cemeteries around this area too where there were tributes today. So definitely there's a little bit of both. And tonight the veterans are leaving with a lot to think about. It's been a very long day for all of these veterans, and they're glad this time when they come back, at least, that they're not fighting. They have a chance to at least enjoy and appreciate the ceremonies.
Before we go, I must ask, although you're obviously there in a professional capacity, has it been an emotional day for you as well to cover this momentous occasion?
It certainly has, especially being here at this cemetery. You have a chance to take a look over all the gravestones and realize that there were so many people who risked their lives here so long ago. It's hard to imagine that such a calm and serene place right now was alive and in the midst of a bloody battle for Omaha Beach 50 years ago. It's an amazing experience to be a part of.
All right, thanks very much for sharing it with us, Judy.
Thank you, Nancy.
That's Judy Fortin live from Normandy with a close-up perspective on a truly historical day. Now for a very different perspective, here's Bill.
Thank you, Nancy. As the public, veterans, and politicians observed D-Day today, there were some notably younger spectators who were front and center in St. John today. ATV's Sally Cummings is standing by live in St. John. Sally?
Well, they were grade ones, Bill, from Island View Elementary, who were on hand for the D-Day celebrations in St. John this afternoon. And the politicians were happy to see them there, and they told them that they hope they never forget the sacrifices that were made in World War II. Grade ones waved their flags patriotically and listened intently to men in uniforms decorated with medals.
On this special day, we offer up a prayer. May the people of all nations be united in thy care.
And to all our future generations, we pray that our country will not ever have to go to war ever again, so that all of our young people will be able to have a good life and to live in Canada.
Why are you here today?
Because it's D-Day.
And what's that all about?
When all the people died of the war.
Do you think they understand what it's all about?
Probably not all of it, but I think they're starting to understand a bit, and I think if we do things with them, that they will understand more.
To remember the people that fought in the war for us, because they all died for our land.
This is why we're doing this stuff so many years ago.
Erin McPhee took a moment to explain the meaning of D-Day to her children, too.
They don't realize the whole picture of it, why they're doing this and why we wear poppies. in November and whatnot.
This St. John High history class reflected on the war today and debated whether the sacrifice was worth it.
It's kind of a tough question, isn't it?
If D-Day had failed, the invasion would have had been put off for another year probably before they could have amassed the same number of troops and things.
Realistically, D-Day was a 50-50 chance. It was a gamble all the way, and it would have to go down in history as the most successful gamble in history.
And you'd have to wonder if the Allies didn't invade Normandy at that time, how much longer could Britain hold out?
And Bill, it's nice to see a younger generation taking such a keen interest and having such a good understanding of what D-Day is all about.
And Sally, it looks like there was a tremendous turnout for D-Day observances in St. John today.
There were a lot of young people there, and the grade 1 children actually presented a flag to the city this afternoon, and the city will be planting a flower bed with the D-Day symbol on it, so the remembrance will continue all summer long.
Thank you, Sally.
Okay.
Live in St. John.
Know where he was going, but about years later, then I found that he was gone.
Caroline Young of Escazone is remembering her father, Private Charles Doucette, who was executed in action on June 7, 1944, after being captured by German troops from the 12th Panzer Division during the D-Day invasion. Private Doucette was one of the region's Micmac natives who served with the armed forces as a member of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. He was among a group of 20 prisoners who were shot by Commander Kurt Meyer in the Abidjan near Caen, France. Yvonne Colbert, the Second World War, the British government was forced to make one of the hardest decisions during that war.
It was a decision that remained one of the best kept secrets of the war. Keep Hitler, should he invade England, from getting his hands on Britain's vast gold reserves.
Of all the British parliamentarians, Winston Churchill knew months before the fall of France that Britain would not be able to hold back the Nazi tide that was sweeping over Europe. There was only one way to keep Britain's vast gold reserves from falling into the hands of the Germans: ship every ounce of gold and other valuable assets to Canada. The French and Norwegian governments, on a much smaller scale, also became partners in this $7 billion transfer. And what's so surprising about this operation is the fact that the transfer of this enormous wealth from ships to trains was not discovered until long after the Second World War ended. I came across this incredible wartime story while researching another story at the Public Archives in Nova Scotia. There, in 2 boxes, were the personal collections of the late Frederick Smith, who was at the time General Superintendent, Eastern Division of the Canadian National Express. Included in the Smith collection were telegrams, waybills, and other correspondence showing the exact dates and amounts of the gold shipped to Canada. Of major concern of the British and French governments was getting the gold safely through the submarine-infested waters of the North Atlantic. The time was not on England or France's side. The German army was on the move. All selected securities were scooped up, packed in thousands of boxes, and placed aboard special trains that sped across the country to Scotland, where British warships waited to carry the precious cargo on a treacherous voyage to Canada. On an October morning in 1939, the first treasure ship sailed safely into Halifax Harbor. The shipment of gold bars, gold coins, stocks, bonds, and certificates would continue for the next 4 years. While military and other life-saving supplies were being loaded aboard merchant vessels for war-ravaged England, the treasure ships under tight security slipped quietly into Halifax Harbor. Waiting at trackside were special sea and express trains that would carry the gold safely out of the Maritimes to Ottawa and even New York. In New York City, the gold would buy Britain the much-needed war supplies. However, that was before the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. During wartime, Halifax Harbor and its docking facilities were the busiest in North America. But nothing remains the same. Only the memories of the way it was lingers. Most of the 600 people who were involved in the gold transfer have passed on, but not all. Ed Mahoney, a retired CN employee who just turned 80, remembers how heavy those gold bars were to handle and what it was like to ride the heavily guarded gold train west.
Stevedores unloaded it on dollies. They wheeled it across the shed between two lines of armed guards to the cars. We loaded the gold in the car, and I'm telling you, they were heavy.
Once a special train was made up, 50 armed guards, along with express employees, including Ed Mahoney, left the CN station in Halifax.
And we rolled through the night. Everything on the way had to pull into a siding to let us go through. There was no stops except for water and fuel. The glass in the cars were all blackened out. You couldn't see anything, and the guards were in the car and sealed up. Anybody that wanted in had to have the proper identification and signal before you'd open the door for them when they wanted to relieve you for your shift and all that sort of thing. But carrying the old double-barrel shotguns, I don't know what would have happened if somebody ever tried to get it, but they couldn't go very far with it.
The first stop the train made was Montreal. The vaults of the Sun Life Assurance Company's 24-story building located on Dominion Square became the wartime home for Britain's stocks, bonds, and certificates. The gold train's final destination was Ottawa, where under the shadow of Parliament, the gold was trucked to the Bank of Canada's vaults on Wellington Street. When the transfer was completed, the gold reached up to the ceiling. Surprisingly, not a penny was lost or stolen. The gold and other securities would remain in Canada until the end of the war. Perhaps, as Churchill, known for turning an appropriate phrase or two, might have said of the operation, never before have so many kept so great a secret so incredibly well. In Halifax, Bill Jessam, ATV News.
British subjects have returned to the beaches of Normandy 50 years after D-Day and what proved to be the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. The Canadians who stormed Juno Beach were honored and remembered at Bonney-sur-Mer at ceremonies attended by the Governor General and the Prime Minister today.
Great event of World War II known as D-Day. We remember courage, dedication, sacrifice, pain and suffering. We remember our soldiers, our airmen, our sailors, those who took part in that historic operation that was the beginning of the liberation of Europe.
They shall not grow old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
All those who are buried here must have understood that war is the sorriest admission of human failure. But they also knew that 50 years ago, the price of peace was war. They recognized that this was the apocalyptic battle between good and evil, between oppression and freedom. Whatever happened to them individually, they knew they were battling for life, the life of democracy, And they recognized that the battle was being waged against the death of the human soul that comes from being enslaved.
Normandy today, the Queen and French President François Mitterrand laid wreaths at Bayeux. Ceremonies across the 50-mile invasion zone featured more than 35,000 veterans from 8 countries. And at Omaha Beach today, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, President Clinton, the Queen, President Mitterrand, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, and others paid tribute to the thousands of Americans who died during D-Day. Dozens of Canadians who died following the D-Day invasion did not fall in battle. They were murdered by SS troops commanded by General Kurt Meyer. He was charged with the murder of nearly 6 men and found responsible for the murders of 18 carried out at his own headquarters. ATV's Rick Grant tonight has the story of a Nazi general who went to Dorchester Prison instead of the firing squad.
In my estimate, around 45, somewhere around that, were murdered outright.
Stan Dudka was among the North Nova Scotia Highlanders who fought Kurt Meyer's SS troops and was captured on June 7th following the D-Day invasion. Dudka was in the Abbey of Ardennes, Meyer's headquarters, when the murders were carried out.
But they were shot right in the back of the neck with their Luger, and right behind Kurt Meyer's headquarters there.
General Meyer sent the corporal who fired the shots to a post in which he would face certain death.
Now, what does that tell you?
He wanted to get rid of NCO, so he couldn't testify against him if they ever come to trial.
Bill Bailey, who was a company sergeant major with the North Novas, avoided capture that day.
I knew them all, yes.
Civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
In December 1945, a Canadian war crimes trial found Kurt Meyer responsible for 18 murders.
He was responsible in the same way that any commanding officer is responsible for the actions of his troops.
Kurt Meyer shot through the ranks of the SS and at 33 became the youngest German general and led the 12th Panzer Division made up of young men who progressed through the Hitler Youth, examples of the master race.
And was he a good soldier? I think he was a good soldier.
Author Tony Foster studied the career of Meyer, and Foster's father was General Harry Foster, who was among those who convicted Meyer.
My father, who convicted him, he didn't think he should have been convicted either.
Another Canadian general commuted Meyer's death sentence to life in Dorchester Prison.
Meyer did his time in this section of Dorchester, the prison hospital. He was essentially in protective custody here because by the late 40s and early 50s, some of the inmates were Canadian War veterans.
Incredibly, while Meyer was serving time in Dorchester for murdering Canadian soldiers, the Canadian Army dressed the Nazi general in a Canadian Army captain's uniform and slipped him out of prison.
They dressed him up as a captain so he could participate in a particular operation that they were doing up in Yellowknife.
Meyer served only 8 years for the murders, and he was sent home and set free in 1954. He died of a heart attack in December 1961, celebrating his 50th birthday. In Dorchester, Rick Grant, ATV News.
Anna Maria, when you're not off covering stories in other parts of Europe, you are the CBC's Berlin correspondent, and I know you've talked to German vets about D-Day. How does that color your perspective as you watch this story unfold today?
Well, interestingly enough, Allison, D-Day, as you actually might have figured, does not play a big role for Germans. They don't know a lot about it. Children growing up don't hear a lot about it. The veterans there, what amazed me was, for the most part, the people that I talked to who were here on that day fighting for the German side now look back on all of this as a terrible tragedy, and they really see it as something that stole their youth and something that they have no real pride in, except that they fought for the country that they thought they were doing a duty for. It's interesting as well that I've talked to individuals in the streets of Berlin, and they've said that D-Day in effect liberated them as well from the tyranny of their Nazi leaders. But for the veterans themselves, this day is a day they feel that the Allied veterans should celebrate and should acknowledge, and that they have every right to celebrate and acknowledge. And there's a bit of melancholy in it all, because they look back and they see how many people died throughout it all, and they feel a lot of sorrow. Also, there are German veterans here in this time, and some of them have gone to grave sites of Allied soldiers and laid wreaths today and yesterday and in the last few days.
You were at Omaha Beach earlier today, Anna Maria. What will you remember most about watching that ceremony?
Well, it was extraordinary to be in a place with so many world leaders and to see everyone celebrating this all together. But the things that will stick in my mind are the individual moments. There was one veteran on a beach and his wife was rolling a video camera and he was pointing and he was trying to explain where he was on that day to the video camera. And when he finished, he looked at the camera and he named his grandchildren and he says, "This is for you so you won't forget." And I think for me that was probably the most touching moment in this day.
Thanks very much for telling us about it, Anna Maria.
Okay, Allison, good night.
Before we go tonight, we're joined by the CBC's Brian Stewart, who's been in Normandy throughout this time. Brian, you've covered wars, you've covered anniversary celebrations similar to this one. What goes through your mind as you watch events like you saw today?
Well, I think more than anything else, when I look at the veterans and the gallant effort many of them made to march in various ceremonies today, is the extraordinary toughness of these people. I don't think it's possible you can't compare the wars of modern times to anything like the ordeal they went through in the summer of 1944, the shock of that invasion, and then the ghastly Battle of Normandy in which 5,000 Canadians died, and then 333 more days of marching across Europe. They're remarkably modest, and they talk about their modest role in the war, insist they weren't heroes, insist they played a small part. What they endured was absolutely incredible in terms of fear, hardship, and endurance. And it's a remarkable testament that so many of them are here, though the saddest part of today is that you see them looking out to sea and the familiar places, and so many of them are saying at the same time this is probably the last time they will ever see Normandy, and it's the last close memory of the territory they fought through here.
And yet, Brian, while those soldiers may in some sense be modest, there were so many lofty words spoken today and so much emotion wrapped up over the past few days. Is there an after effect? What remains after something like this?
Well, I think there was a big after effect of the 40th anniversary, actually. It's watched very closely in Europe. It brings a kind of strong pan-European feeling to these events. There's the little hotel next to where I'm standing, the French couple own it. A German couple has visited. He used to serve in the Wehrmacht here in Cannes. He was one of the occupiers. They become great friends. He sent a telegram, or a fax rather, to the French owners of the hotel today saying, "I am terribly sorry I can't be with you. I know what must be going through your hearts as Frenchmen today." And they said that's the new Europe. And there is that extraordinary feeling that out of the crucible of war, the terrible events of 1944, has arisen a new Europe. And I think that feeling is very strong today, that what was done here has enabled the world to move on to a brighter future.
Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison.
And with that, we end our special report on the D-Day anniversary. Thank you for watching. I'm Allison Smith. There is more D-Day coverage coming up next on News World on Petrie and Prime with Ann Petrie.